So, over 58,000 people died during the Vietnam War with the U.S. occupation. But the U.S. occupation was only from 1964 to 1975. And the Vietnam War truly started in the middle of the 1800s. This resulted in more than 58,000 casualties. And although you may have heard that the war was fought between the communists and the South and all that, it's only half the story. The Vietnam War actually started due to international turmoil between the Vietnamese, the Japanese, and the French in the 1800s. So it brings us to point number one. It all started with the French. During the French conquest of Indochina in the middle of the 1800s, the French had invaded Southeast Asia and began to occupy these countries, and that was Vietnam included. For nearly 100 years, the French stayed in Vietnam. To make matters worse, during the beginning of the World War II, the Japanese began to invade Vietnam in the 1940s. The pride of the Vietnamese people was damaged and they were enraged. So much to the point where they wanted to take back their country. They wanted to be free of this occupation. And this was all, it culminated into one person. His name was Ho Chi Minh. And this is our point number two. Ho Chi Minh was probably the biggest name of the Vietnamese hope in the 1940s. He was born by the name of Nguyen Sinh Gum on May 19th of 1840. And Nguyen grew up and studied communism in France and in Russia. Upon his return in 1941, he began to use the name Ho Chi Minh and created a fighting force that basically was geared towards the fighting the foreign invaders, and they were called the Viet Minh. With the victory of the Allied forces in World War II, the Japanese had withdrew from Vietnam, but that still left the French still occupying Vietnam, and so that left a perfect opening for the Viet Minh to attack and take back their country. So after the Viet Minh had attacked the French and regained their country, Ho Chi Minh became the president of Vietnam. But that still wasn't the end of the story. The French couldn't let Vietnam slip through their fingers, so they attacked once again in 1954 in hopes of retaking the country. This decisive battle led to the Geneva Accords, which basically split the country into the North and the South. And this leads to our third point. The battle between the Communist North and the Democratic South, which we are all familiar with. It wasn't until the late 1950s that the U.S. began to support Vietnam. In 1964 to 1975, nearly 9,087,000 active military personnel were sent to Vietnam. Although the U.S. had military superiority, they were unable to even dent the morale of the Vietnamese people. This made the 18 years in which the U.S. Was in Vietnam a long standoff, and nothing was achieved because of how well the Vietnamese people fought. But the 18 years didn't just affect the soldiers at war. It also affected the American people back at home, which leads back to our final point, the protest of the American people. Pictures of the war were circulating in and out of Vietnam that was showing what the horror of the war was about. This created speculation from the American people, who now wanted the withdrawal of the American troops from Vietnam. For years, the American people kept protesting about the war and wanting their soldiers to come back home, and they finally got their wish back in 1974 after the resignation of President Nixon. Basically, in 1975, all U.S. military troops were withdrawn from Vietnam, and rendering the South Vietnamese regime utterly helpless against the North, and they couldn't do anything, so it led to their fall. So the Vietnam War wasn't just a political war between the North and the South. The Vietnam War was also was started because of French occupation, was fought for freedom by Ho Chi Minh. It was split in two by opposing political views, and then it was inevitably ended due to protest. The Vietnam War was truly a bloodbath between nations, but what it really showed was that the people's voices can be heard. And so, if you really want to change something, go and go and speak out, because we can see what happened with the protest in America, the American people. So basically, in this picture here, if we can get back, we can see that Hanoi is the north, and then Saigon was the south, and right in the middle was the demilitarized zone, which basically it shows how the this country was split in two because of the Geneva Accords. So if we can get a closer view of that, there we go. So that was my informative speech, and thank you for listening.